Greetings, Cougars. I'm Professor Pachel, and this is my brief introduction to poetry. Well, poetry's been around for thousands of years. It's one of the central celebrations of language in the human experience. It's been around pretty much since shortly after humans started speaking to each other. Poetry's been sung and recited for a long period of time before humans developed writing. So the first poetry was spoken or sang, okay? It had its origins in musical songs, chants, and religion. Poetry, much poetry, and especially much of the earliest poetry, is religious poetry. And it's still, a lot of poetry still has that, if not in content, in spirit. There is sort of a religious or mystical aspect to poetry, but don't let that scare you, okay? Because poetry is human. Don't forget that. If you want to think about it this way, humans were hunter gatherers at first, right? They didn't have structure. They didn't grow crops. They didn't have a lot of even uh, organizational structure of human groups. They did not have religion, okay? And so how things progress is typically societies develop agriculture, they start growing crops. And then after that, they religion comes very quickly. And if you think about it, once you get on the crop cycle, you've got planting, harvest, you've got to know the seasons, you've got to know the weather. And humans wanted something to explain these, or they looked for answers. And they found those answers in religion a lot of the time. Now, once you get religion and agriculture, uh, art usually follows afterwards, or agriculture, religion. Then you start getting poetry because poetry has been used to celebrate, to teach, and to understand religion for many years. So once poetry comes, we get songs, we get chants. Eventually, it is accompanied by musical instruments. And I want to just talk about some of the characteristics of poetry. So think about this. Get out your pen and paper. Um, Poetry is typically, it's really hard to define because there's so many different types and genres of poetry. But one thing that is true, and think about this. I said that poetry started in music or in song. So, one of the things that we can say about poetry is that typically it is arranged for sound. Okay, so word sounds are important. The way that words are arranged in lines for their sound is important. So, poetry typically has beats in it. Yes, beats, and those beats make up the music. If you think about it, poetry came from music. So, or poetry and music sort of developed together in song. So it makes sense that even poetry that does not rhyme, and poetry doesn't have to rhyme, has sort of a rhythm or a beat. Okay. Poetry typically evokes specific emotions like fear or sadness or happiness, joy, anger. You know, those things. Poetry is concise a lot of the time. It's not prose. In other words, it's not written in paragraph form, although there are some paragraph type of poems. Even those are going to have a certain musicality to them, depending on the poet. So these feelings come in a concentrated way or an intensity. Poetry often uses figures of speech like metaphor and simile and metonymy and synecdoche and personification. I invite you, in fact, I exhort you to look into the literary lexicon at our Canvas site to study the terms of poetry because you're going to need them as we go along through this section. Okay, so poetry comes in all lengths and forms, and as I said before, it doesn't have to rhyme. If you now think about this, the Odyssey is a poem that's hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and then there are haikus, which are 3 lines long. The thing to remember is the rhythm and the lines. That's one of the things that is distinctive about poetry. Okay, so if you think poetry is difficult to understand or it only belongs in English literature classes, think about it once more. Poetry is all around us. I, it's in commercials, it's in advertisements, it's in songs. It's even your favorite sportscaster often uses poetry. You know, when a sportscaster says, um, say it's a baseball game, a sportscaster says, "And here's the pitch. It's a rocket. It's going to left field. Kemp is on his horse." Right now, that's bizarre, right? You're describing the hit as a rocket. That's metaphoric. Saying that an outfielder is on his horse, that's metaphoric for running, right? So, and we use poetry all the time in everyday speech. We use metaphor, we use simile to describe things. So don't be intimidated by poetry. Some of it's more difficult than others, but you can read it, you can understand it with a little bit of concentration and a little bit of know-how that we're going to go through. You got to know those terms. Okay. Hey, if you listen to any kind of music with lyrics, whether it's pop, country and western, rock and roll, or hip hop and R&B, you're listening to poetry. Rap and hip hop, very impressive poetry and lots of those songs. Country and western, think about the themes of country and western: loss, love, um, celebration, partying, those kinds of things. So songs are poetry as well. So you're listening to poetry quite a bit. Here's some things to consider about poetry as you read it. As I've said before, poetry isn't all one things. Poems come in many different forms, different styles and genres, as there are people writing them. Making judgments based on one style or poem is like deciding you don't like music after hearing one type of music. So think about that. Uh, you can't just, there are poems that are very difficult, like John Milton's Paradise Lost, right? Another one, hundreds and hundreds of pages. It's an epic, okay? You can't say, oh man, I tried to read Paradise Lost. I hate poetry. There are sonnets, you know, these certain number of lines in a sonnet. 14 lines, 14 lines, yeah, in a sonnet, right? So you have haikus, 3 lines, you have sestinas, right? You have all kinds of different poems. You have poems that don't have any rhyme scheme or set number of lines or stanzas at all. But a lot of poetry will be very easy for you to understand if you think about it a little bit. Now, something else, a good poem is not a secret message that you need some kind of decoder ring to understand. Now, as I said before, you do need some know-how. It's good to have some training. Just like with anything, it's good to understand figures of speech. It's good to understand some things about types of poems, like lyric poems or personal poems, and that's mostly what we're going to read is lyric poetry. So um, it's not something that is super difficult to decipher. It's not like some secret thing that the author has put out there and you have to figure it out. In fact, you want to get away from the idea that poetry is some sort of message from the author. We talk about the speaker of the poem. That's the voice of the poem. That's the character of the poem. And sometimes the speaker is just a voice, really. So you got to remember that. So get away from, you know, the author is telling us this here or the author's message. Dispense with that kind of talk, okay? We're talking poetry here. And poetry is in the poem. It's in the voice of the speaker. Okay, so let's see. Give yourself a chance to get at the method and the theme or the meaning of a poem. Rich poems can have many interpretations, but interpretations should always be based on a close understanding of the specifics and language of a poem. Okay, so so there are different interpretations, okay? But there are limitations on interpretations. Some are better than others, and some are just wrong or ridiculous. So you want to push yourself a little bit to get at the meaning of a poem, especially if it's a little more difficult. But sometimes the meaning, the most sensible meaning, or the one that you don't have to work as hard to get at, makes sense. Try to stay away from super wild, bizarre readings of poetry, right? You want to get the feel for the poem, figure out the theme or the concept or idea behind the poem, and you're on your way. Okay. So it's not just like, well, poetry is just whatever anybody thinks. Everybody has a different opinion of poetry. Well, that's true to some extent, but we're a little more technical here. We're doing this for study purposes, right? Let's see. So, a poem can't mean anything if it could mean everything. So, close reading, creativity, and critical thinking are the keys to reading a poem. Study that literary lexicon, it's in pages. Okay, reading poetry has similarities to reading fiction or plays. We've read some fiction, we've read some plays, but it also has its own specialized terminology that you will need to know and use. So consult the literary lexicon and pages at our Canvas site. And as you read, consider the questions for reading poetry in our book. And also, they will be available at our course site as well. And lastly, poems aren't too fragile or too hard to read and know. Okay, they need you to read, reread, and think about them before you make judgments about their meaning. And here's something very important, Cougars, and that is read poems out loud. Poetry was meant to be read out loud, it's meant to be recited. So think about that as you're going through our section on poetry. Take time to read the poems out loud. Take time to feel what they sound like, okay? And you'll be on your way. So it's time to get into some poetry. Uh, get into it, as I said, with creativity, critical thinking, and close reading, and study those terms in the literary lexicon. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.